Before Western colonization of the Americas, wild areas were sustainable natural landscapes that were carefully managed by humans for the needs of future generations and for ecological sustainability. What happened? This may be the answer that we need in order to save our wildlife and save the planet. Rewilding is really closely linked with the concepts of wilderness and natural systems. So we have these wilderness areas across the world, and they are all managed in different ways or not managed at all. On one side of the spectrum, there are wilderness areas that are absolutely hands-off, untouched areas where there is no development, but there's also no one managing the development of those lands. With the whole other side of wilderness areas being highly managed areas such as, think of Yellowstone National Park, the amount of pressures and stressors on that wilderness versus pretty much untouched land. So there's this big spectrum of how much we are actually going to get involved with managing a wild wilderness space. There has been some form of wilderness management in most countries for time immemorial. Prior to European colonization of North America, indigenous people used controlled burns as a wilderness management technique to manage natural landscapes. These wilderness management techniques sustained the culture and the resources available for people to survive on that landscape. So what was initially observed by European colonists as these wild, untouched landscapes underneath had actually been quite altered and supported by human management techniques. After European colonization forcibly removed many indigenous people from their lands, those landscapes that had been very carefully managed had now pretty much been abruptly changed. Once colonists held the power in North America, some of them feared controlled burns, some of them supported it to a certain extent, but overall fire suppression techniques and then the resulting environmental landscapes in North America had been drastically altered because there was this disruption of natural human management practices. I think the concept of how we traditionally manage lands is really important to bring into the discussion of rewilding. Rewilding as a term was originally coined by members of the group Earth First, who I've discussed already in my deep ecology video, which I will link to above. And I really like the term that they used for explaining rewilding. They say rewilding is a conservation method based on cores, corridors, and carnivores.
I don't want to live if there aren't any rhinoceroses. I don't want to live if there aren't any mountain lions in California. That's what my life is for. It's to throw it in the wheels of this insane progress.
Civilization as we know it has completely transformed the landscapes. Revolution and a change in our global consciousness and how we think of wild areas and how we think of humans and how we fit into those wild areas is absolutely needed to restore the earth to something that can carry on and sustain us for future generations. Rewilding as a conservation concept is aimed towards restoring ecological biodiversity and movement corridors and recreating as many aspects of the wild landscapes as possible and how they were prior to human civilization absolutely exploding. There's an aspect of that that is a focused management part as the first initial step. So we are reintroducing old animals that have since gone extinct on those landscapes. Then we are restoring environmental corridors, wildlife movement corridors that have been since destroyed by industry. And then we are bringing that all together to recreate natural landscapes. And once those natural landscapes are restored, then we are able to have more of a hands-off approach. We're able to step back a bit and allow those natural landscapes to thrive without as much human intervention as we do now. So this could mean a return to more traditional indigenous management techniques. So it's really important to think about how we did manage those landscapes and how those landscapes sustained our population for time immemorial before a time of globalization and colonization. The key is to restore those keystone species, those carnivores. Ideally, at this point, we would reach a self-regulating ecosystem that is able to thrive without heavy human involvement. The key here is to create something sustainable, Every single day, we are creating a planet right now with the way that we run things on this earth that is not going to be around for future generations, that's not supporting our current excess materialism and increased exploitation of the Earth's resources. So we have to incorporate these sorts of rewilding campaigns in order to restore the planet so we can continue to thrive as humans. You know, when you restore the predator diversity because of these trophic cascades and these complex ecological systems, you are restoring the herbivores, you are changing the shape of rivers when you're introducing wolves into certain landscapes. Everything is interconnected, and supporting the introduction of keystone predators into these biodiverse landscapes is going to restore the planet to how we once had it. I obviously am very supportive of this technique. I think it is a way of thinking about conservation that has the potential to absolutely change how we are doing things. When we are focused on just one species, we have to expand the way we think about wildlife conservation beyond single species management into larger multi-species management, habitat conservation projects. And that luckily is starting to become more and more of a thing. The way that we are thinking about conservation in wild areas is absolutely changing, but it's a long process and it requires a shift in thinking. Examples of that are reintroducing the bison into Banff National Park. We're also seeing the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park, changing landscapes, and really exciting and interesting science that is supporting the reintroduction of these animals. I wanted to ask two biologists, one who is working in the field of wildlife biology in North America and one who is currently studying wildlife biology in Britain. And I want to ask them what they think and whether or not this is realistic to our actual real life boots on the ground people.
On the one hand, I think the idea of pure wild nature is something that drives a lot of us as conservationists. This notion that nature as itself has its own value and should be allowed to operate on its own terms. On the other hand, in my mind, there's a broader goal in conservation of the successful continuation of the existence of wildlife species. And I think oftentimes that's going to mean using every tool available to us, and sometimes that will include the hands-on management of animals. And these hands-on management tools may be positive, like introducing wildlife species to areas that they had previously been extirpated from, or introducing vaccines into wildlife populations to stave off diseases introduced from domestic dogs and other animals, to something more negative. For example, there are cases where removing animals from ecosystems may be actually a way to save a great number more species. In Kenya, for instance, there's a great deal of conflict between livestock herders and lions. Lions may kill the livestock of a herder, and in retaliation, they will sometimes poison carcasses of their cattle, and entire lion prides will die out. But not only lion prides, but hyenas and jackals and vultures and all the animals that fed on the carcass. And so in those cases, as a conservationist, you need to ask yourself, if you came upon an agreement with the community that one or two lions would be removed as a way of assuring that they don't poison carcasses to kill a great number more animals. In cases like that, if your goal is to keep more lions alive, you succeeded, even if you've taken an action that you feel is morally distasteful. How can we best keep animals alive in a way that strikes a balance between the needs and wants of people and animals? If we try to only think about restorative conservation measures, only going back to relatively untouched states of nature, then we're setting ourselves up for failure over and over again. Where we can, we should try to create pristine ecosystems, but often I think we need to operate under a good enough principle, where the world we're in is one that is sufficient to have these wildlife species and allow them to operate, in comparison to a world where we decide that good enough isn't sufficient and try to remove humans from the equation entirely, in which case the humans will win and the animals may not be there.
I think that the rewilding versus more hands-on approach to conservation is a much debated topic right now, especially here in the UK. The UK is the 29th least biodiverse country out of the 218 surveyed using the Biodiversity Intactness Index. We clearly need to up our game in terms of reinstating biodiversity, but the manner in which this is done is widely disputed due to the different theories about what Europe looked like ecologically before humans started to interfere. The most widely accepted theory up until recently has been the closed canopy theory. This is that before human intervention, most of Europe and the UK were covered in species-poor dense forest. If this were the case, and we were to take a complete hands-off rewilding approach, one argument is that we would lose many other habitats of high biodiversity, such as wildflower meadows, as nature would revert back to closed canopy woodland. However, this theory is based off of pollen records, which scientists claim only show pollen from closed canopy tree species, such as oak, ash, and beech, before human intervention on the continent. These claims are now being refuted due to new evidence which strongly suggests that Europe and the UK was in fact made up of a mosaic of many different habitats. For example, studies of beetle subfossils, as well as a better understanding of how oak trees need high levels of light, all suggest that before human intervention, the UK was made up of a patchwork of grassland, scrubland, and groves, as well as forest, mostly due to the grazing of megafauna which prevented succession. I prefer to believe the latter of these theories. I think it is selfish for us to believe that we alone were the creators of highly biodiverse environments. For that reason, I would prefer to take a rewilding approach to conservation, rather than forcing the maintenance of certain ecosystems just for the sake of a few species. However, going completely hands-off, especially here in the UK, is also a bad idea. Humans have driven the extinction of so many species here. The brown bear, wolf, lynx, elk, and beaver all used to roam the country, and would have played a massive part in maintaining biodiverse habitats. Therefore, I think a mixture of letting the land go, as well as a more hands-on approach in order to reintroduce these species, and perhaps maintain some of our more fragile habitats, such as wildflower meadows, is the best approach for now. With a little bit of help, nature will find a way of restoring itself.